In this video, we're going to look at organs of the digestive system. I'm dividing it up into two parts. So in part one, we're going to look at the mouth, esophagus, stomach, and the liver. And then we'll look at the intestines and the pancreas in the next video. First, let's have a look at the mouth. The main bones that make up the mouth are the maxilla and the palatine bones, which form the roof of the mouth. And then the jawbone is composed of the mandible. We have a couple of different kinds of teeth. So in the front, on the top four and the bottom four, those are the incisors. And beside those, on the top and bottom, we have canines. These are the teeth that we use for tearing and cutting food. And then we have the premolars and the molars, which are used for grinding up our food. And it's very important to grind up our food properly so that it makes it easier for the rest of the digestive system to break down those food molecules. The tissue that surrounds the teeth is called the gums or the gingiva. So if you had gingivitis, then you would have inflammation of the gums. Back here, this little hanging piece of tissue is called our uvula. And when we swallow food, this is going to push back and it will actually block the openings that go into the nasal sinuses so that when we swallow food, it doesn't go up our nose. Back here, we can see tonsils, which are part of the immune system, and they produce white blood cells that can help us fight infection. And the tongue is covered with a lot of different taste buds. We have multiple different kinds of taste buds, and even within each taste, say sweet, for example, there are more than one kind of taste bud. Taste buds in specific detail are covered in another chapter, but we can generally taste sweet, salty, sour, bitter, and savory. Sometimes savory is called umami, which basically is that meaty, savory taste that we, if you eat a piece of steak, then that tastes like savory. And I also want to point out that the salivary glands are releasing saliva into the mouth as we are chewing our food. And the salivary glands are about 95% water, and the rest is going to be composed of mucus, some ions like sodium and potassium, and digestive enzymes. So the saliva will have amylase and lipase that starts to break down starch and fat. So as we are chewing the food, it is going to mechanically break down into smaller and smaller pieces with the addition of the saliva that helps us to moisten the food. We produce the enzymes that start to chemically digest some of those molecules. And the mucus helps to also make it lubricated so that it's easier to swallow. We also use saliva to dissolve nutrients. So as we start breaking down those food molecules, we can taste them once they're dissolved in liquid. Here we can see our bolus of food. I made it green so it looks like this person is eating vegetables. And we have our tongue here, very powerful, strong muscle with a lot of slow twitch fibers, which means it has a lot of endurance. So our tongue muscles can contract for a very long time, talking and eating. And as we form this bolus of food after we've chewed it, we're going to push that bolus down into this pharynx area. And the pharynx is common with the respiratory system and the digestive system. So down here, we have this opening in the top of the trachea called the glottis. And this is where air is going to travel as we breathe. Now, when we swallow food, we have to cover this so that food doesn't go into the airway. So the epiglottis, epi means above, is going to move down and block off the trachea. And the food is going to pass to the esophagus, which is the tube behind the trachea. Now, as the bolus of food moves down over here, you can see that the epiglottis is covering the glottis, and the food is moving down here. Now, we have muscles in the esophagus, circular and longitudinal muscles, that are going to push that bolus of food continuously down the esophagus. And this movement is called peristalsis. So the muscles, circular and longitudinal muscles, are going to contract and relax in a way that pushes the food down. Once that bolus of food reaches the stomach, there's going to be physical contact of that food touching the walls of the stomach, and that's going to trigger secretions. We can actually trigger secretions with our mind too. You can start to release digestive enzymes and hydrochloric acid by thinking about food. We'll talk about the regulation in another video. So once that bolus of food hits the stomach lining, then more secretions are going to start entering the stomach. And we're going to now, that bolus of food is going to become chyme. When the bolus of food reaches the stomach and it becomes chyme, then the food is going to become more and more mechanically and chemically broken down. So it becomes smaller and smaller physical pieces. And then we're going to have some digestive enzymes that will start the breakdown process of protein. Okay, we're going to have several exocrine secretions that go into the stomach. So let's have a look at the structure of the stomach. So you can see where your stomach is located in our upper abdominal cavity. So below the sternum, so if you felt your chest bone and then move down just a little bit more, your belly button is probably somewhere around here. So your stomach is above that. Now we have our esophagus. Food has moved through the esophagus and into the stomach. Now there is a ring of muscle here called a sphincter, the gastroesophageal sphincter. Sometimes it's called the lower esophageal sphincter, and sometimes it's called the cardiac sphincter. And that is because this first part of the stomach, this upper portion here, that's purple, is called the cardia. So sometimes we say that's the cardiac sphincter. Now this ring of muscle closes after we deposit food into the stomach and we start to make hydrochloric acid. Hydrochloric acid actually helps to stimulate this muscle to contract so it closes. Then, as the stomach muscles are contracting, food should not be going back up into the esophagus. So we need the sphincter to keep the food in the stomach while we're digesting it. In the last video, I talked about the layers. So just briefly, the outer connective tissue layer is called the serosa. And then we have the muscularis layer, where we have 3 layers of muscle, longitudinal, circular, and oblique muscles. And they will all contract in different ways so that we can mix the food very, very well. Then under that, we have the submucosa layer, and the innermost layer is the mucosa. Now the stomach, other than this cardiac region, we also have this green region up here, which is called the fundus. Then this grayish blue area is the main body of the stomach. And then down at the bottom, this region here is called the pylorus. Now after food starts to enter the stomach, we can see in here that we have lots of little folds. These folds are called rugae, and they allow the stomach to expand. When our stomach is empty, it holds a space. There's a space of about 75 milliliters. This little container here is 100 milliliters. So 75 mils when your stomach is empty. It's very small. And some stomachs, everybody's a little bit different, but some stomachs can hold up to 2 liters or more. So picture a giant pop bottle, right? Don't drink it. Just picture it. And that's how much your stomach can expand. That's how much food and liquid can fit in your stomach. And the ability to stretch is because of these rugae folds. The pyloric area is the last portion of the stomach right before it meets the small intestine. The beginning part of the small intestine is called the duodenum. And here we have another sphincter. This pyloric sphincter stays closed while the stomach is digesting food. Now, food is going to stay in the stomach and mechanically and chemically break down food for as long as it takes for all of the food to be ready to move into the small intestine. Okay, so let's just, for example, if you think about eating some strawberries. Okay, so fruit is very easy to digest. It would move through the stomach quite quickly. Whereas if you eat a piece of steak, that takes much longer to break down. So if you ate strawberries and steak at the same time, I don't know why you would do that, but just suppose, then the strawberries would stay in the stomach as long as it takes for the steak to break down. Okay, then once that chyme is ready for the small intestine, then the pyloric sphincter will relax and stomach contents will start to move into the small intestine. Now, inside the stomach wall, I want to point out a few different cell types that produce different exocrine secretions. So remember that an exocrine secretion is something that is released either to the lumen of a hollow organ, like the stomach, or to the surface of your body, like sweat glands. Whereas an endocrine gland secretes hormones into the bloodstream. So the exocrine secretions in the stomach include mucus, which is produced by the goblet cells, hydrochloric acid, which is released by the parietal cells. And the parietal cells also make a substance called intrinsic factor, which we need to bind to vitamin B12 so that later on in the small intestine we can absorb vitamin B12. And then we have our chief cells, which produce pepsinogen. Pepsinogen is a molecule that will be cleaved or broken up by the hydrochloric acid to form pepsin, and then pepsin starts the chemical digestion process of proteins. The last thing that I want to talk about in this video is the liver. The liver has hundreds of functions. It's an extremely important organ, and luckily it has a great ability for regeneration. If you donated half of your liver for someone else because they needed a liver transplant, that liver would grow back into a full liver within a year. So as we go through this list, I want you to think about what symptoms would you have if your liver was getting damaged. So the liver can become damaged from fatty liver disease, which can be caused from alcohol consumption or from eating excess sugars. Right? So you can start to damage your liver that way. Also toxins like drugs. Your liver can be damaged from viruses like hepatitis viruses. Okay, so as we go through these functions, think about what symptom would you have if the liver stopped doing that function. Here's a diagram showing our three main accessory organs. So the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. We'll talk about the gallbladder and the pancreas in the next video. So the liver is broken into two different lobes, and it is where we produce the bile, and the bile is going to move into these hepatic ducts and then into the gallbladder through the cystic duct, which is where it will be stored. Okay, then when we need to digest fats, it will be released through the common bile duct. Now, we're going to just look at the functions of the liver. Now, the liver, the main cell type are called hepatocytes. So anything hepatic is related to the liver. So that's why hepatitis is a virus that infects the liver. The liver also contains Kupffer cells, which are a type of immune cell that will help to break down dead cells. They help to break down red blood cells like the spleen does as well, and it will also help to get rid of pathogens. Okay, so when we look at the main functions of the hepatocytes, there are many different things. All right, we'll put a little list up here as we go through the different functions. So number one, the liver makes bile. The liver makes bile out of cholesterol. So the liver produces cholesterol. We eat some cholesterol, and then the liver makes the majority of the cholesterol. So we use cholesterol to produce bile. We also use it to make steroid hormones and other things. Okay, so bile is required for the digestion of fats. Okay, it acts like soap, so it emulsifies or breaks down fat molecules. Now, when we eat food, we have what we call is the absorptive phase, or it's the phase when we're eating, as opposed to the phase when we're fasting or when we're not eating. Okay, so when we're eating food, we will take in nutrients that we don't need at that particular moment. So we have to be able to store those nutrients for later. And the liver plays a really important role in that. So as food is being absorbed in the small intestine, it will go into the bloodstream through the hepatic portal vein and go directly to the liver. And the liver is going to store a bunch of those nutrients, and then it will leave the rest in the bloodstream to then circulate to the rest of the body. So during the absorptive phase, one of the things the liver does is called glycogenesis, which is the genesis or the production of glycogen. So we can convert excess glucose or sugar molecules into glycogen. We store glycogen in the liver, and we can also store it in our muscle cells. The liver will also convert some molecules into fat, so we can convert extra glucose and extra amino acids into fat molecules, and that is called lipogenesis. So extra nutrients, only a very small amount is stored as a carbohydrate, glycogen. The rest is stored as fat. So if you eat more calories than you need in a meal, the majority of it will be stored as fat. And then later in the fasting phase, we'll use that. So then in the fasting phase, now we have to break down stored nutrients so that we can maintain our blood sugar. So the pancreas and the liver are both very important for helping to regulate blood sugar. The pancreas will make hormones like insulin or glucagon that will tell the liver to either store nutrients or break them down. So the breakdown processes are glycogenolysis. So lysis means to break down. So this is when we break down glycogen back into glucose molecules, and then that can go into the bloodstream. We also have gluconeogenesis, which is when we make glucose from other nutrients like fat or protein. So the liver can break down other molecules and convert it into glucose. And then the liver can also break down fatty acids. So when we store fat, we store most of it in the adipose tissue, but we can store some in the liver. Okay, that's called visceral fat. We don't want too much stored in the liver, but some that is stored there can be broken down from fats into fatty acid chains and then into ketones. So when we break down fat and then use it directly to make energy, it will first become a ketone or a ketone body, and then that can enter the Krebs cycle where we can make ATP. Now, other functions of the liver. So the liver produces lipoproteins. These are molecules that help to transport fat in the bloodstream. So when we produce triglycerides, then we have to be able to transport them to the adipose tissue where we store them. The liver will store excess fat-soluble vitamins like vitamin A, D, E, and K. The liver also stores minerals like excess iron and zinc and magnesium. All kinds of minerals can be stored in the liver. And then excess will be excreted with the urine. So eating liver is actually extremely healthy because of all the vitamins and minerals that are stored there. When we break down proteins, proteins have, here's a structure of a protein or of an amino acid. Amino acids have nitrogen groups. We don't use the nitrogen for making ATP. So the nitrogen group is a waste product. Now, that nitrogen group, the NH3, that is ammonia. But that is a very, very strong base. Okay, so it has a very high pH. So we can't have too much ammonia circulating in our blood. So the liver will convert that into urea. And then urea will circulate in the blood, and then eventually the kidneys will excrete it. Other functions of the liver. It can do the same job as the spleen in the sense of breaking down red blood cells. When red blood cells are broken down, the hemoglobin is broken down, and the heme portion, okay, that is a waste product that is converted into what we call bilirubin. And this has a yellow pigmentation, and this bilirubin is normally excreted in the bile. So it will become a waste product that goes into the bile, and then eventually it will go through the rest of the digestive system. Okay, and we'll have a bowel movement. If the liver isn't working properly and that bilirubin starts to build up, that yellow pigment will start to become visible in the whites of your eyes and your skin, and that is called jaundice. The liver can also break down toxic molecules. So any kind of toxins that we're exposed to in our environment, different kinds of pollution, if we eat food that has pesticides, if we take medications or drugs, alcohol, okay, those kinds of things are broken down by the liver. And those waste products are always put into the bile, so then they'll go through the digestive system before they're excreted. In the last video, I mentioned that If you don't have a bowel movement every day or on a regular basis, toxins can be reabsorbed back into the body, into the bloodstream. So I just want to point that out here again, that this is why it's very important to eat a lot of fiber so that your digestive system is getting rid of waste on a regular basis, because your liver is putting toxins in there to try to get it out of the body. All right, couple more functions. So the liver also makes a molecule, a protein called albumin. Albumin is a blood plasma protein, and it plays a really important role in regulating blood osmolarity. And this will affect how much fluid leaves the blood vessels and goes into the tissues. If you had too much fluid leaving the blood, and if albumin wasn't there to hold fluid in the blood vessels, then more fluid would leave and go into the tissues, and that would cause swelling or edema. Okay, so if you see people that have puffy ankles or swelling under their eyes, it could be that the liver isn't making enough albumin. It could also be other things. Okay, it could be kidney problems. Okay, so it's not always the liver. But one symptom of liver damage would be swelling. Okay, the liver also makes a molecule called fibrinogen. This is important for blood clotting. So if you cut yourself, this fibrinogen needs to be able to be activated so you can produce fibrin and make a blood clot. The liver produces a really important protein called angiotensinogen. And this is a protein that will be activated by a molecule made in the kidneys called renin that will break this down, and it's part of the renin-angiotensin system. And the main thing that you need to know about that right now is that that is very important for regulating blood pressure. So the renin-angiotensin system is in place to help us retain body fluids so that we can maintain our blood pressure. Okay, so if we can't make angiotensinogen, then we'll have blood pressure regulation issues. The liver activates vitamin D. So we know that when our skin is exposed to UV light, UVB rays from the sun, we produce vitamin D. Well, we technically produce a precursor to vitamin D. And the vitamin D is then activated by the kidneys as well, but primarily by the liver. So then we have activated vitamin D, which is important for bone and mineral homeostasis, as well as immune functions. The liver produces insulin-like growth factor. When your pituitary gland makes growth hormone, it will activate insulin-like growth factor, which contributes to the growth and regeneration of all kinds of cells in our body. And lastly, it's not the last thing it does, but the last thing I'm going to talk about is it produces proteins called complement. And complement proteins are always circulating in the blood, and they play a really important role in immune functions. So when we're infected with pathogens like bacteria or viruses, complement plays a role in helping the innate immune system deal with those infections. So the liver does a lot of really important things. Here's a summary chart, and I also added a column of symptoms that you might feel if your liver wasn't working properly.